Hey there, Liron here. Thank you for joining me in another lesson. In this one, we're going to talk about how to simplify the colors. Now, if you've been following my work, you know that a big part for me of simplifying the colors is just using fewer colors. So usually my color palette is based on just a lot of primary colors. I'll get maybe 2 blues, 2 reds, 2 yellows, and I'm done. That's all I need. All of my secondary and tertiary colors are going to be a result of mixing those primary colors. This leads to better color harmony. This leads to an easier painting process. It's just so much nicer, and everything works out together well. Now, in this lesson, I want to show you a bit of a different approach to simplifying the color, and that is deciding that for every layer, every glaze, if you want to call it that way, you're going to use just one color, or maybe one extremely dominant color and a supporting color. And I'm going to show you how I do this. I'm going to paint first a fully yellow layer, then a almost fully red layer, and finally a blue and with some variation layer. And it's just so fun because for this layer, I'm going to focus just on one color. And think about how much easier it makes the process, how much of the pressure it takes off of you to just know all you need is this yellow for this layer. And you will see people do this very often with blues, just setting up an underpainting of some of the light and shadow, and then adding the yellows and then adding the reds. There are all sorts of variations to this, but I did want to show you in this lesson something a little different than my usual minimal palette. So we're actually going to focus on one color per layer here. I hope you're going to enjoy this one. Let's get into the demo. So first things first, I will include a high quality scan if you want to follow, recreate the drawing process exactly as I have. I skipped that for this one, but definitely feel free to use that just to have a baseline to work off of. Now, the first color I'm going to be using, or the first layer, is going to be dominated by yellow mainly. What I chose to do, as I mentioned, is go from yellow to red and maybe a bit of blue, and finally just blue. The reason for that is that, and you will see again, people using all sorts of different colors for this. But to me, I like that because yellow tends to be naturally the lightest, and then red slightly darker, and ultimately blue is the darkest, even though sometimes reds are darker than the blues. Now, again, what I like about this is all I have to focus on is the areas. It's physically where I'm going to paint, as opposed to what color I'm going to be using, or even what value I'm going to be using. For the most part, I'm using very wet paint to maybe medium wet paint. So it's not just a tea consistency, if you will. It's not just super flowy paint. You can see what it looks like on the palette, but some areas, yes, I'm using a bit thicker paint for just to get some dark accents right out the gate, especially for areas that I know for sure are going to be dark. But the main key here is look at what I'm avoiding. I'm avoiding the forehead, I'm avoiding the highlights on the eyes, the highlight on the edge of the nose. And if you can simplify the work process for yourself in a way that you only have to focus on what you're going to paint, that can be very, very useful to avoid other types of challenges. So try to have a very clear drawing that really shows you where the light and shadow are, and then follow it. And don't worry if things look a little strange. Some paintings go through an ugly stage. Some people refer to it like that. Some paintings just don't give the clear impression in any given moment, and that makes sense because think about it, it's just the painting is being created. It's not going to look complete until it's actually complete. So follow the process, keep going, fill in the areas you should be filling in, and hope that it will end up working. For the most part, I find that if you just follow that process, it does in fact end up working. So I'm going to paint around the face. I'm using a brush that I like. This is a Leonard brush. I believe it's a size 6, but it's a mop, so it's a bit of a different sizing. It's kind of the equivalent of 16 or 14, something like that. The reason I'm using it is that I do have large areas to fill in, so I need that flexibility of the mop. But on the other hand, it does have a decent tip, so I can fill in some tighter spots more easily, so I get the best of both worlds. If I didn't have these tight spots to work around, I'd probably use a bit of a thicker brush, even larger than that. Maybe I have another Raphael flat large brush. Again, adding some reds to it. Okay, it's not purely just one color. But that's because, and it's an important distinction to make, once you're in the painting process, you may suddenly realize that it needs something else. So to me, it felt like, okay, I love that yellow, let's add just a few red accents to it, because they're so close in my mind. They're both warm, they're both kind of, I'm keeping both light here. I knew that it will still look good, and it will still be, feel like an inherent part of that first yellow wash, so no problems with that. You'll notice very often while I'm working on something, I quickly change my mind. It's just another thing, another aspect you may find yourself doing. If you like something at first, but then once you put it in, you realize it could be so much better by adding things. It is important, if you have that urge or that feeling while painting, to listen to it. Don't worry about changing plans a bit, as long as you have a big kind of macro plan to follow, which is skipping the highlights in this example. Very simple. Now I'm getting to the area of the lips, and you see me slowing down a bit, switching to a thinner brush, just to make sure that I got those edges of the shape, edges of the face, accurately. And then there's the fingers that also have a few key highlights I want to preserve. And that pretty much sums up this initial wash. Very pretty wash, I like that. You could use this opportunity to put in some wets and wets for areas you want to darken a bit, or areas you want to keep the interest going, because the paper is still quite wet. If I move it, tilt it to the side, you would have seen it has a serious sheen on it, especially the lower half. The upper half is starting to dry a bit, but the lower half is really wet. You can actually see the water kind of bead down there. And then there's this bit of a extra highlight I don't need, get rid of it. Of the finger. Shape of the lip actually should be a little different, but that's fine. The highlights is in the wrong spot, but that's something we can pretty easily fix later on. But in any case, yeah, that does it for the first wash. Again, mostly yellow, a bit of red, just a few touches here and there. Now what I like to do is just give it a look, make sure everything's kind of in the right spot. Sometimes you may need to lift, you may need to charge a bit. If there's an area that's too dark, you may add water to it. That's very common. And onto the next wash we go. I'm using red this time. The yellow was a yellow ochre. The red is kind of like a Quinacridone Rose. So it's a slightly cooler red. It's nothing like a Pyrrole Scarlet, nothing like a cadmium red. So it has a bit of a pink kind of feeling to it. And this time I'm going to be much flatter with it, so I'm going to be very much using just the red. But notice what I'm doing here. I'm using two brushes simultaneously to get different sizes, different highlight shapes. If you look at the edge of the hair, there are quite a lot of highlights in it, and I want to make sure that I preserve these. But in terms of where I'm painting, this wash is very similar to the previous one. With this one, I'm going over basically the same areas. Now you may ask yourself, why go over the same areas? Why not just do it in one wash? The answer is very simple. This is a big wash. I'm covering large areas, and to make sure that I have a good flow, I'd much rather use thinner paint. But thinner paint is obviously lighter. So what do? We simply do multiple layers. Instead of one dark layer, you can do two lighter layers. So that's my logic here. Now, it is going to be just ever so slightly different because I want to preserve those gradual changes. I'll keep some areas with just the yellow showing. I'll keep some areas with the yellow showing a bit and darken with the red. Okay. Now I'm not committed in this example to following the values exactly. I'm more interested in the overall composition of the scene and the face. Making sure the highlights are in the right spot, but within the shadows, I'm actually going to turn this into a bit of a higher key painting, meaning it's all going to be a little lighter. We're going to have the paper white, and the darkest areas are going to be slightly lighter than what you see in the reference photo. So yeah, working my way. Again, this is nothing special. You can do it too, trust me. I'm just going over the same areas and putting some red paint over them. Again, the logic is to slowly darken it while preserving the lightness in the shapes, making sure they're correct and preserving the flow of the wash. Very important. Sometimes just letting watercolor be watercolor, letting them flow the way they want, is much more important than a lot of other things. Believe me, the flowy effect and the wet in wet and all of those good stuff play a really big role in first making sure it looks like a watercolor, which may be a concern to some people because they love that look. And by the way, notice how I'm going over her hair that's behind the face on the other side of the face, to the left of the eye and the nose, because that's slightly darker. So I'll actually make it pop by darkening the background later on, okay? Same goes for the hair that shows under the chin and to the almost next to the neck. So I'm darkening that spot. The reason I don't start with the face is just because I want to finish what I started with the smaller areas first. But then I can go on and start creating the shape of the face by adding those lights and shadows. But in any case, yes, the major concern here is where, not necessarily what. And not what color, because obviously, again, we're going with preset colors, and not what value also, because that's kind of a flat washes. And if you are having trouble with going a la prima and getting dark here, light there, which is something I love doing, to be honest with you, I love doing that. But if you're having trouble with that, you can always work this way. And I wanted to present you with this work process. Very wet washes, just make them multiple washes. And challenge yourself to try interesting ways of simplifying. Go with a blue initial wash or a purple one, glaze over it like a yellow, see what it looks like. Because you'll find that many different combos will look good to you, and figure out what you like. Now my wash here, the goal is to start rendering the hair and making sure I go as dark as necessary, but also connecting it to the shadows of the face. Keep in mind, this is still the second wash. It's pretty light still, so I know I'll need to darken further. So all of these shadows on the face, I have to connect them at the moment and make sure I include everything while taking care of my edges. That's the one thing that I see a lot of people struggle with. Yes, you want to paint a large shape, but the edges play an important role. If there's a gradual transition, you want to preserve that. If there's a sharp transition, you want to preserve that. And sometimes you have to take a break from the full wash to make sure the edges work. And you see me alternating here between the big brush and the smaller brush. So I use the smaller one to blend those edges and make sure they're smooth, and then I'll switch back to the large brush to continue rendering the shape itself. Take your time with the edges. Okay, the edges aren't something that takes just one try. Now you will see the paint continue to flow over the eyelid, and it may need some blending again. You may need to come back again with water and blend that edge. So be prepared for that kind of a thing, okay? It just doesn't just end immediately. Now slowly you get to see how it starts to feel like the shape of the face is taking place here. Again, nothing realistic here yet, and if at all, nothing hyper accurate necessarily, but the shape of the face comes through. Now notice how I left a little gap between the red and the yellow on the nose. The reason I left it is because I do plan on maybe blending that red edge onto the yellow. And that way the viewer will probably have a good time just seeing that transition and feeling that there's also yellow underneath. Even if you look at the forehead, you can still see the yellow popping through the red. It's not just, I didn't just glaze over everything mindlessly. I actually planned for where things are and how they're going to look. And here I put even, I think it's the teeth, but I'll see. Maybe I'll fix them later on. Should probably be darker. Now I'm looking at the mistake I made with the previous wash with the lip. If you remember, I told you the highlight was in the wrong place, but look at it now. Now it's going to fall into place because I put it where it should be. And closing off that shape from earlier, trying not to touch the wash that's already started drying. Between the chin and the neck and the shadow behind it, and just rendering a few of those creases on the lips, very few. Now remember, the wash I have at the moment is still wet, and again, if I tilt the paper, you'll see it has a decent sheen. So I may revisit some areas, especially on the hair, and just get them perhaps a little darker. I may not do that too, but sometimes I'll decide spontaneously. Sometimes the time has passed and you can't do anything anymore. So it really will change from one painting to another. I will say this, if you want to avoid, overworking the hair, I do find it important to put a lot of its details wet in wet. That really helps to just to make sure that things flow. You get some smoother edges on the details you put. Just like I'm doing now with the fingers. I'm putting the shadows now so that I don't have to do too much later on. I could have done that with many parts of the face, actually. But again, some of it will just depend on where I'm at in the painting, how I feel about it. It could dry too fast and then I miss my chance. But for the most part, again, if you want smoother, I'm taking care of that other eyelid. If you want smoother transitions, try and do them wet and wet, especially for hair and stuff that are at danger of overworking. And I will say, err on the side of caution when it comes to that. Like, don't try and paint each and every strand of hair. That's not necessary unless you're going for hyperrealism and you really take your time and you do it properly. But if you're just going to wing it, I would suggest against it. I would suggest establishing the overarching shadows of the different areas of the face and maybe adding a few details. So if you look at the hair, for example, above the eye, straight above the eye, it's at its darkest maybe, and maybe to the right of the eye, close to the ear. Establish these as large forms of shadows. You will see me do that later on. Just a large form of shadows. And then you can decide, even after it dries, okay, I want to add some more details to it. I want to add some few strands of hair that just make things a little clearer. Okay, now I'm adding, there's a bit of an area where there isn't so much highlight on the nose. It's due to its very interesting shape, I think. It curves in space, and so some parts aren't really a highlight, so I'm putting that in. There's also the other side of the forehead that I may darken just a bit with a bit of yellow and red, just to show its roundedness. You'll notice that the highlight doesn't actually end all the way to the edge of the face. There's this thin line of a bit of yellow, and that could also come at a later stage too. You don't have to do it right now. So in any case, now it's been some time. This wash is dry, and I'm moving on to the next. Now this time, blue is going to be our dominant color. I'm using this. It's a very interesting blue. It has this cerulean feeling to it. And it's naturally pretty light, so I'm actually adding a bit of red to it, but you're still going to see the blue really pop dominantly in a lot of these areas. Now I'm reaching out to another blue, which I believe is a French ultramarine. The key here, again, I don't really care what colors I'm using. I care more about the temperature. So first layer is going to be very warm. It's the yellow. Second, red. I just look for the category of the paint. Okay, this is really important. I don't think I said it earlier. I'm looking for the category of paint. So a category of yellow, I can mix a few yellows too. I could mix a few reds. I could mix a few blues. That's all fine. Because in the grand scheme of things, they're going to connect to, I think, a beautiful glazing of warm and then very warm and then kind of cool. So here you go. Just a bit of that blue and red. One more thing I want to emphasize here is start your washes humble. I'm not opening up a big shape that I then have to worry about all the edges. I'm starting small. I'm starting with the corner. I'm stopping at the hair. And I'm slowly rendering the details before I'm opening up the shape. That's really important. If you're in a hurry, which happens a lot with watercolor, you may feel stressed or nervous. You have to get things looking right the first go or whatever. You may end up missing the fact that it's better to take a break like I'm doing now. You see, I'm trying to figure out some shapes for the hairs, and only then I'm going to continue the shape so that I have just fewer edges to take care of. Now, you see me going for a bit of a more dominant blue in some spots, a bit of a weaker blue in some others, while adding a bit of red to it. I love that variety and that changing in the hue itself. As long as it's kind of in the blue neighborhood, that's fine. So going around the hand, finishing up with the background, basically. You see I left this area I said for the hair that's behind her nose and eye to the left of the face. That was really important. And now I'm putting in those patches of background that show through between the shoulder and the chin and the fingers. It's a small shape, so just go for it and complete it and then move on to the next shapes. Now you see the hair is lighter here, so I need to work around that. And I'm putting in a bit of blue wet and wet just to up the blue. Sometimes the blue just won't go dark enough, so I add a bit of red, but then I put blue wet and wet back into it, and it looks really, really good. So now I need some very dark paint because the hair and some of the shadows on the face are pretty dark. So take your time, and I left a lot of this mixing action in just to show you, because I very often I'll cut it out, but you have to understand that it is longer than you may think. I'm really taking my time and trying to mix the right value, the right color, the right temperature. In this example, it's more about the right, at this stage, it's more about the right value because we know the colors, and the temperature doesn't really, it's just what we chose, the blue, in advance. So at this stage, it's just getting that darker value so that we get the hair dark. That's pretty much the first instance of this painting where it actually matters. So far, we've gone with a very light wash. Now, as I get to this area, look at how dark the hair goes. And I could do this right now. Like, I could go right now, reach to a darker paint and go for it, or I can let it go for now and then continue later on. Now, there are a few areas that are a little lighter in the hair, so I'm considering leaving them as highlights, but here's an interesting technique for you. I took more water and added them into this area. It's a bit of a more watery wash than up top. What this does is it keeps it lighter, okay? And then onto that lighter section, I can start dropping in wet and wet to get things darker. Again, you'll see this in action. It's actually a really nice process. Darkening that spot I told you earlier that needs to be way darker. And you'll notice the hair is much darker than the face here. While it's wet, you can still, again, go ahead, put wet and wet, darken it a bit more. Some people wonder how the paint stays wet for so long. It's about putting a wet wash to begin with, and then also mixing fast. Sometimes you need to mix a little faster. We're not just talking about shapes here. We're actually talking about darkening an existing area. And you see I'm pulling on those hair strands wet and wet, putting the darks where the darks are, and then keeping this midsection beautiful and well lit, because there is a lot of, again, highlights there. And there are, again, multiple ways of rendering those. You could go strand by strand. I don't recommend it for most people in most styles. But if that's something you want to experiment with, sure, go for it. It could work. Some people pull off amazing, hyper-realistic paintings that way. And it's just beautiful. Now, I'm going to continue doing this with the hair as much as necessary while it's still wet. But it is important to remember, this is all going to be merged with the shadows on the face. So you do have to be aware of the edge. And you see where it's touching now? Because the edge of the hair was so dark, I could afford a few more minutes of it starting to dry. Because it was so I don't know if I want to say dark, but thick paint. Thick paint, when you put it on paper, it is forgiving when you put water next to it. And that is something that I can narrate to you all day long, but the only way of really understanding it is to feel it in action. If you put a very thick brush mark on paper, yes, it's going to dry faster, but it's going to be forgiving to some extent if you put a wetter wash next to it. Because it will reawaken it very often. And this is what happens with the edge of the hair and the face here. So that was a neat effect. Allowed me to keep my cool and work on the hair, give it some time. And yeah, the shadows on the face should probably be a lot darker. And hopefully I will darken them later on. I just don't remember how dark I went at this stage. I do know it's going to be kept a much higher key painting for sure. But hopefully I'll darken them just at least a little bit more. Now, there are a few strategies to filling in this area. There's this highlight where the, I guess, muscles of the cheek are. Next to the cheek, you see this highlight right where I'm at, leading from the nose to the corner of the mouth. So I'm kind of skipping that. I'll later charge it with some water to make sure I don't get a hard edge there. But the beautiful thing about doing these washes is, even if it's not dark enough, if you're using a wet enough of a wash, you still have time to react. So I can actually charge more paint into it. which I think I don't do at this stage, but you can still do that. Now, I want you to notice one other interesting thing. The more layers I add to these more shadowy areas, the more the highlights pop. Like, look at the highlights now. They're much more full of life and much more impactful because now they're in the right context. They're actually not surrounded by a bunch of kind of similar values. They're surrounded by much, much darker paints. And I also want to direct your attention to one more thing. Look at the hair. Now you can see how that wet and wet process really did an interesting job in terms of keeping the hair simple. And you don't need much more than that. And especially because it's just the edges and the peripheries of the scene. The focal point is really the edge of the face and the eyes and the nose and the mouth. So the hair doesn't need many details. So doing it just wet and wet is a really good idea. So yeah, now I am attempting to darken this a bit. What I'm encountering is some issues, and it is important for you to see how I kind of wing my way through it. I'm encountering some uneven drying issues. So some areas already started drying. So once I go wet and wet, the paint moves in some areas, it doesn't move into other areas. So I need to help it move. And you saw me using the water sprayer just to help it move a bit. Plus, I will just be covering areas manually. You see me just going over them manually and covering them if the paint doesn't want to move there. One more thing that can help is tilting the paper a bit, which I feel more free to do when I'm not filming, but it is a possibility. You can tilt the paper and help the paint move in the direction you want. The main takeaway, I think, from this specific stage is just to know that the watercolor process can be messy. It will be messy very often. And if things don't go your way, don't get discouraged, but rather try and pull them back together. It really is an important lesson to learn because a lot of people panic. I see this a lot with my students. A lot would just panic, and there's no real need to. You can really just continue working. Ask yourself, does this part need to be darker? Okay, I'm going to darken it. Is this a part I need to paint around and be careful with? Okay, I'll paint around that. You see like the teeth here. There's no need to really panic. And nothing really is lost until it is lost. Now, things still aren't in the full context yet. For example, these dark areas of the face may appear even too dark at this stage because I still didn't put the really fully dark shadows that you can see on the eyebrow. You can see them between the hair and the face. So again, remember, we're still not at a place where things fall into the perfect context. And this is why it's just so key to work through that awkward stage of the painting and to really figure things out. And it can be very misleading because you think to yourself, okay, if things don't look perfect now, it's like I'm done for. That's actually not the case. It's such an, like, the more advanced of a stage in the painting process you are, the quicker changes are. So when you put the first wash, yes, it's very watery. It just goes there. And it seems like you're working very slowly. And the more the painting progresses, the more these washes, they actually are very impactful. So anything you'll do here will have a pretty strong impact. So even though we have 3 minutes to the process itself, to the painting process, it will still be very impactful. You'll see the small changes we'll do from this point onto the end are going to be pretty big. So starting with putting those dark values that I just mentioned. For the eyebrows, mainly between the hair and the face, I think that's where the key for the overall shapes is going to be. Obviously, the eyelashes and some areas under the nose, under the nostril is another important one. But look at how it just kind of puts it into balance. So even though the entire thing is significantly lighter than the reference photo, notice how just putting in those darker values puts everything into a very nice balance and makes it just look a little closer to the reference photo. It doesn't have to be perfectly like the reference photo. Most of my paintings aren't like that. Most of them don't aspire to do that. And as a side tangent, once in a while I will feel like doing that, and I will do a painting that is very close to the reference photo, and then I'll be like, okay, that's enough. That's enough realistic painting for a year, and then I usually go back to this because it's more fun to me. You'll notice some areas need to be better blended, like the eyelid of the left eye, which is to our right. And there are some, obviously, changes that can be done and improvements, but we're really near the end here. Lifting that highlight on the side of the cheek and where the nose is was actually really useful. Turned out to be an important stage. Now notice what I'm doing here. I'm putting in those darkest shadows with my blue, which I think looks really good, especially because I did want the blue to be a little more dominant in some areas here. And that really makes it pop, I think, in a really nice way. It stands out from the reds that we put earlier and the yellows. And it's just a beautiful harmony. Now there is this very gentle, you see shadow there that goes around from the under the hair. This stage basically is just small corrections. So here's the left side of the forehead that I mentioned to you earlier that should be a little darker. Hopefully that will, it's just small fixes that help move the painting in the right direction. Needs a bit of red and yellow just to make it a little more like the reference. It's just small fixes. I know a lot of people are worried about, going too far with these small fixes. I find that if you take a break from the painting sometimes and you will revisit it after a few minutes, you will know and sorry for bumping the camera, you will know if you should continue or not. If you're really torn about whether you should continue with a painting or just stop at some point, what I would suggest is to take a break, take a few, even like 30 minutes away from the painting. We're so close to it while painting so that you just don't know. You don't know if you're imagining things. You don't know if things read clearly. Right now you see the sun starting to set, and it does come through the window, so you see some of the sheen on the upper parts of the painting, and it makes it generally lighter, even lighter than it actually is. So that's a little misleading, but again, you won't know whether you're done or not when you're so close to the painting you just worked on. So feel free to step back for a while, see what it looks like in better light with fresher eyes. I'm just going to add a few of these details of the hair. Should have gotten them, to be honest, way before. Connected to the previous wash, but that's fine. Some of these require darkening, so I'm going to darken those. But we're really in the last few stages here. Not much to add. The values work together well in a relative way, meaning the value of the hair and the value of the background, the value of the shapes of the facial features, the darkest spots on the face, they all work together well. So even though they're not the exact same as the reference photo, relative to one another in their own context, I love the way they look. I love that kind of a thing. And I love that you can see the details in the shadow on the face. Sometimes you have the tendency to really kill those mid values, turn them fully dark. I had that a lot, and I'm actually happy that they are visible here. So I'm just going to sign this real quick and give you a proper look of the final result with a picture I took and up close, and now we can wrap it up. So I hope this makes sense. Again, there are plenty of ways of simplifying based on color. You can minimize the number of colors you use. You can use just one or two colors. You can paint monochromatically, which is something I love doing. So not necessarily black and white, but you can just go from white to purple and use everything in between. Another common color for that is sepia. You will see a lot of people paint sepia or Payne's gray, some of the more muted colors. So that's one way. Another way is to decide you're going to start with one flat color and then adding different colors on top of that. Remember, due to the watercolor's transparency, this leads to beautiful effects. And one last note, you can also focus on temperature and push that in different ways. Have the focal point be changed by how you use the cool versus warm. If you put a little bit of warm inside the cool, or if you put a little bit of cool inside the warm, these are great ways of simplifying the color and having an interesting impression. I hope you enjoyed this one, and when you're ready, let's move on to the next lesson.